Chapter 4 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Atascosa. For the next few days we paralleled the coast, except when forced inland by various arms of the Laguna Madre. When about a week out from the Arroyo Colorado, we encountered the salt lagoon, which threw us at least 50 miles in from the coast. Here we had our last view of salt water, and the murmurings of the Gulf were heard no more. Our route now led northward through what were then the two largest ranches in Texas, the Running W and Laurel Leaf, which sent more cattle up the trail bred in their own brand than any other 4 ranches in the Lone Star State. We were nearly a week passing through their ranges, and on reaching Santa Gertruda Ranch, we learned that 3 trail herds of over 3,000 head each had already started in those 2 brands, while 4 more were to follow. So far we had been having splendid luck in securing water for the herd, once a day at least, and often twice and 3 times. Our herd was becoming well trail broken by this time, and for range cattle had quieted down and were docile and easy to handle. Flood's years of experience on the trail made him a believer in the theory that stampedes were generally due to negligence in not having the herd full of grass and water on reaching the bed ground at night. Barring accidents, which will happen, his view is the correct one. If care has been used for the first few weeks in properly breaking the herd to the trail. But though hunger and thirst are probably responsible for more stampedes than all other causes combined, it is the unexpected which cannot be guarded against. A stampede is the natural result of fear, and at night or in uncertain light this timidity might be imparted to an entire herd by a flash of lightning or peal of thunder, while the stumbling of a night horse or the scent of some wild animal would in a moment's time, from frightening a few head, so infect a herd as to throw them into the wildest panic. Amongst the thousands of herds like ours which were driven over the trail during its brief existence, none ever made the trip without encountering more or less trouble from runs. Frequently a herd became so spoiled in this manner that it grew into a mania with them, so that they would stampede on the slightest provocation, or no provocation at all. A few days after leaving Santa Gertruda Ranch, we crossed the Nueces River, which we followed up for several days, keeping in touch with it for water for the herd. But the Nueces, after passing Oakville, makes an abrupt turn, doubling back to the southwest, and the Atascosa, one of its tributaries, became our source of water supply. We were beginning to feel a degree of overconfidence in the good behavior of our herd, when one night during the 3rd week out an incident occurred in which they displayed their running qualities to our complete satisfaction. It occurred during our guard. About 2 o'clock in the morning. The night was an unusually dark one, and the atmosphere was very humid. After we had been on guard duty possibly an hour, John Officer and I riding in one direction on opposite sides of the herd, the rebel circling in the opposite. Officer's horse suddenly struck a gopher burrow with his front feet, and in a moment horse and rider were sprawling on the ground. The accident happened but a few rods from the sleeping herd, which instantly came to their feet as one steer, and were off like a flash. I was riding my nigger boy, and as the cattle headed towards me, away from the cause of their fright, I had to use both quirt and rowel to keep clear of the onrush. Fortunately, we had a clear country near the bed ground, and while the terrified cattle pressed me close, my horse kept the lead. In the rumbling which ensued, all sounds were submerged by the general din, and I was only brought to the consciousness that I was not alone by seeing several distinct flashes from 6-shooters on my left, and realizing that I also had a gun, fired several times in the air in reply. I was soon joined by Priest and Officer, the latter having lost no time in regaining his seat in the saddle, and the 3 of us held together some little distance, for it would have been useless to attempt to check or turn this onslaught of cattle in their first mad rush. The wagon was camped about 200 yards from the bed ground, and the herd had given ample warning to the boys asleep, so that if we three could hold our position in the lead, help would come to us as soon as the men in the camp could reach their horses. Realizing the wide front of the running cattle, Priest sent Officer to the left and myself to the right, to point in the leaders in order to keep the herd from splitting or scattering, while he remained in the center and led the herd. I soon gained the outside of the leaders, and by dropping back and coming up the line, pointed them in to the best of my ability. I had repeated this a number of times, even quirting some cattle along the outside, or burning a little powder in the face of some obstinate leader, when across the herd and to the rear I saw a succession of flashes like fireflies, which told me the boys were coming to our assistance. Running is not a natural gait with cattle, and if we could only hold them together and prevent splitting up, in time they would tire, while the rear cattle could be depended on to follow the leaders. All we could hope to do was to force them to run straight, and in this respect we were succeeding splendidly, though to a certain extent it was a guess in the dark. When they had run possibly a mile, I noticed a horseman overtake Priest. After they had ridden together a moment, one of them came over to my point, and the next minute our foreman was racing along by my side. In his impatience to check the run, he took me with him, and circling the leaders, we reached the left point, by which time the remainder of the outfit had come up. Now massing our numbers, we fell on the left point, and amid the flash of guns, deflected their course for a few moments. A dozen men, however, can cover but a small space, and we soon realized that we had turned only a few hundred head, for the momentum of the main body bore steadily ahead. Abandoning what few cattle we had turned, which, owing to their running ability, soon resumed their place in the lead, we attempted to turn them to the left. Stretching out our line until there was a man about every 20 feet, we threw our force against the right point and lead, in hope of gradually deviating their course. For a few minutes the attempt promised to be successful, but our cordon was too weak, and the cattle went through between the riders, and we soon found a portion of our forces on either side of the herd, while a few of the boys were riding out the rush in the lead. On finding our forces thus divided, the 5 or 6 of us who remained on the right contented ourselves by pointing in the leaders, for the cattle, so far as we could tell, were running compactly. Our foreman, however, was determined to turn the run, and after a few minutes' time rejoined us on the right, when under his leadership we circled the front of the herd and collected on the left point, when for a third time we repeated the same tactics in our efforts to turn the stampede. But in this, which was our final effort, we were attempting to turn them slowly and on a much larger circle, and with a promise of success. Suddenly in the dark we encountered a mesquite thicket, into which the lead cattle tore with a crashing of brush and a rattle of horns that sent a chill up and down my spine. But there was no time to hesitate, for our horses were in the thicket, and with the herd closing in on us, there was no alternative but to go through it, every man for himself. I gave Nigger a free rein, shutting my eyes and clutching both cantle and pommel to hold my seat. The black responded to the rowel, and tore through the thicket, in places higher than my head, and came out in an open space considerably in the lead of the cattle. The thicket must have been 8 or 10 rods wide, and checked the run to a slight extent, but as they emerged from it, they came out in scattering files and resumed their running. Being alone and not knowing which way to turn, I rode to the right and front, and soon found myself in the lead of quite a string of cattle. Nigger and I were piloting them where they listed, when Joe Stallings, hatless himself and his horse heaving, overtook me, and the two of us gave those lead cattle all the trouble we knew how. But we did not attempt to turn them, for they had caught their wind in forcing the thicket, and were running an easy stroke. Several times we worried the leaders into a trot, but as other cattle in the rear came up, we were compelled to loosen out and allow them to resume their running, or they would have scattered on us like partridges. At this stage of the run we had no idea where the rest of the outfit were, but both of us were satisfied the herd had scattered on leaving the mesquite thicket, and were possibly then running in half a dozen bunches like the one we were with. Stallings' horse was badly winded, and on my suggestion he dropped out on one side to try and get some idea how many cattle we were leading. He was gone some little time, and as Nigger cantered along easily in the lead, I managed to eject the shells from my 6-shooter and refill the cylinder. On Joe's overtaking me again, he reported that there was a slender column of cattle half a mile in length following. As one man could easily lead this string of herd until daybreak, I left Stallings with them and rode out to the left nearly a quarter of a mile, listening to hear if there were any cattle running to the left of those we were leading. It took me but a few minutes to satisfy myself that ours was the outside band on the left, and after I rejoined Joe, we made an effort to check our holding. There were about 50 or 60 big steers in the lead of our bunch, and after worrying them into a trot, we opened in their front with our 6-shooters, shooting into the ground in their very faces, and were rewarded by having them turn tail and head the other way. Taking advantage of the moment, we jumped our horses on the retreating leaders, and as fast as the rear cattle forged forward, easily turned them. Leaving Joe to turn the rear as they came up, I rode to the lead, unfastening my slicker as I went, and on reaching the turned leaders, who were running on an angle from their former course, flaunted my fish in their faces until they re-entered the rear guard of our string, and we soon had a mill going which kept them busy and rested our horses. Once we had them milling, our trouble, as far as running was concerned, was over, for all two of us could hope to do was to let them exhaust themselves in this endless circle. It then lacked an hour of daybreak, and all we could do was to ride around and wait for daylight. In the darkness preceding dawn, we had no idea of the number of our bunch, except as we could judge from the size and compactness of the milling cattle, which must have covered an acre or more. The humidity of the atmosphere, which had prevailed during the night, by dawn had changed until a heavy fog, cutting off our view on every hand, left us as much at sea as we had been previously. But with the break of day, we rode through our holding a number of times, splitting and scattering the milling cattle, and as the light of day brightened, we saw them quiet down and go to grazing as though they had just arisen from a bed ground. It was over an hour before the fog lifted sufficiently to give us any idea as to our whereabouts, and during the interim, both Stallings and myself rode to the nearest elevation, firing a number of shots in the hope of getting an answer from the outfit, but we had no response. When the sun was sufficiently high to scatter the mists which hung in clouds, there was not an object in sight by which we could determine our location. Whether we had run east, west, or south during the night, neither of us knew, though both Stallings and myself were satisfied that we had never crossed the trail. And all we did know for a certainty was that we had between 600 and 700 head of cattle. Stallings had lost his hat, and I had one sleeve missing and both outside pockets torn out of my coat, while the mesquite thorns had left their marks on the faces of both of us, one particularly ugly cut marking Joe's right temple. "I've worn leggings for the last 10 years," said Stallings to me as we took an inventory of our disfigurements, "and for about 10 seconds in forcing that mesquite thicket was the only time I ever drew interest on my investment. They're a heap like a 6-shooter. Wear them all your life and never have any use of them." With a cigarette for breakfast, I left Joe to look after our bunch, and after riding several miles to the right, cut the trail of quite a band of cattle. In following up this trail, I could easily see that someone was in their lead, as they failed to hold their course in any one direction for any distance, as free cattle would. After following this trail about 3 miles, I sighted the band of cattle, and on overtaking them, found two of our boys holding about half as many as Stallings had. They reported that the rebel and Bob Blades had been with them until daybreak, but having the freshest horses, had left them with the dawn and ridden away to the right, where it was supposed the main body of the herd had run. As Stallings' bunch was some 3 or 4 miles to the rear and left of this band, Wyatt Roundtree suggested that he go and pilot in Joe's cattle, as he felt positive that the main body were somewhere to our right. On getting directions from me as to where he would find our holding, he rode away, and I again rode off to the right, leaving Rod Wheat with their catch. The sun was now several hours high, and as my black's strength was standing the test bravely, I cross-cut the country and was soon on another trail of stampeded cattle. But in following this trail, I soon noticed 2 other horsemen preceding me. Knowing that my services would be too late, I only followed far enough to satisfy myself of the fact. The signs left by the running cattle were as easy to follow as a public road, and in places where the ground was sandy, the sod was cut up as if a regiment of cavalry had charged across it. On again bearing off to the right, I rode for an elevation which ought to give me a good view of the country. Slight as this elevation was, on reaching it, I made out a large band of cattle under herd, and as I was on the point of riding to them, saw our wagon and saddle horses heave in sight from a northwest corner. Supposing they were following up the largest trail, I rode for the herd, where Flood and 2 of the boys had about 1,200 cattle. From a comparison of notes, our foreman was able to account for all the men, with the exception of 2, and as these proved to be Blades and Priest, I could give him a satisfactory explanation as to their probable whereabouts. On my report of having sighted the wagon and remuda, Flood at once ordered me to meet and hurry them in, as not only he but Strayhorn and Officer were badly in need of a change of mounts. I learned from McCann, who was doing the trailing from the wagon, that the regular trail was to the west, the herd having crossed it within a quarter of a mile after leaving the bed ground. Joining Honeyman, I took the first horse which came within reach of my rope, and with a fresh mount under me, we rushed the saddle horses past the wagon and shortly came up with our foreman. There we rounded in the horses as best we could without the aid of the wagon, and before McCann arrived, all had fresh mounts and were ready for orders. This was my first trip on the trail, and I was hungry and thirsty enough to hope something would be said about eating, but that seemed to be the last idea in our foreman's mind. Instead, he ordered me to take the 2 other boys with me, and after putting them on the trail of the bunch which the rebel and Blades were following, to drift in what cattle we had held on our left. But as we went, we managed to encounter the wagon and get a drink and a canteen of water from McCann before we galloped away on our mission. After riding a mile or so together, we separated, and on my arrival at the nearest bunch, I found Roundtree and Stallings coming up with the larger holding. Throwing the 2 bunches together, we drifted them a free clip towards the camp. We soon sighted the main herd, and saw across to our right, and about 5 miles distance, 2 of our men bringing in another bunch. As soon as we turned our cattle into the herd, Flood ordered me, on account of my light weight, to meet this bunch, find out where the last cattle were, and go to their assistance. With a hungry look in the direction of our wagon, I obeyed, and on meeting Durham and Brownstone, learned that the outside bunch on the right, which had got into the regular trail, had not been checked until daybreak. All they knew about their location was that the upstage from Oakville had seen 2 men with Circle Dot cattle about 5 miles below, and had sent up word by the driver that they had something like 400 head. With this meager information, I rode away in the direction where one would naturally expect to find our absent men, and after scouring the country for an hour, sighted a single horseman on an elevation, whom from the gray mount I knew for Quince Forrest. He was evidently on the lookout for someone to pilot them in. They had been drifting like lost sheep ever since dawn, but we soon had their cattle pointed in the right direction, and Forrest taking the lead, Quarternight and I put the necessary push behind them. Both of them cursed me roundly for not bringing them a canteen of water, though they were well aware that in an emergency like the present our foreman would never give a thought to anything but the recovery of the herd. Our comfort was nothing. Men were cheap, but cattle cost money. We reached the camp about 2 o'clock, and found the outfit cutting out range cattle which had been absorbed into the herd during the run. Throwing in our contingent, we joined in the work, and though Forrest and Quarternight were as good as afoot, there were no orders for a change of mounts, to say nothing of food and drink. Several hundred mixed cattle were in the herd, and after they had been cut out, we lined our cattle out for a count. In the absence of Priest, Flood and John Officer did the counting, and as the hour of the day made the cattle sluggish, they lined through between the counters as though they had never done anything but walk in their lives. The count showed 16 short of 2,800, which left us yet over 300 out. But good men were on their trail, and leaving 2 men on herd, the rest of us obeyed the most welcome orders of the day, when Flood intimated that we would eat a bite and go after the rest. As we had been in our saddles since 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning before, it is needless to add that our appetites were equal to the spread which our cook had waiting for us. Our foreman, as though fearful of the loss of a moment's time, sent Honeyman to rustle in the horses before we had finished our dinners. Once the remuda was corralled under the rush of a tireless foreman, dinner was quickly over, and fresh horses became the order of the moment. The Atascosa, our nearest water, lay beyond the regular trail to the west, and leaving orders for the outfit to drift the herd into it and water, Flood and myself started in search of our absent men, not forgetting to take along 2 extra horses as a remount for Blades and Priest. The leading of these extra horses fell to me, but with the loose end of a rope in Jim Flood's hand as he followed, it took fast riding to keep clear of them. After reaching the trail of the missing cattle, our foreman set a pace for 5 or 6 miles which would have carried us across the Nueces by nightfall, and we were only checked by Moss Strayhorn riding in on an angle and intercepting us in our headlong gait. The missing cattle were within a mile of us to the right, and we turned and rode to them. Strayhorn explained to us that the cattle had struck some recent fencing on their course, and after following down the fence several miles, had encountered an offset, and the angle had held the squad until the Rebel and Blades overtook them. When Officer and he reached them, they were unable to make any accurate count because of the range cattle amongst them, and they had considered it advisable to save horseflesh and not cut them until more help was available. When we came up with the cattle, my bunkie and Blades looked wistfully at our saddles, and anticipating their want, I untied my slicker, well remembering the reproof of Quarternight and Forrest, and produced a full canteen of water, warm of course, but no less welcome. No sooner were saddles shifted than we held up the bunch, and cut out the range cattle, counted, and found we had some 330-odd circle dots, our number more than complete. With nothing now missing, Flood took the loose horses and 2 of the boys with him, and returned to the herd, leaving 3 of us behind to bring in this last contingent of our stampeded cattle. This squad were nearly all large steers, and had run fully 20 miles before, thanks to an angle in a fence, they had been checked. As our foreman galloped away, leaving us behind, Bob Blades said, "Hasn't the boss got a wiggle on him today? If he had made this old world, he'd have made it in half a day and gone fishing in the afternoon, if his horses had held out." We reached the Atascosa shortly after the arrival of the herd, and after holding the cattle on water for an hour, grazed them the remainder of the evening, for if there was any virtue in their having full stomachs, we wanted to benefit from it. While grazing that evening, we recrossed the trail on an angle, and camped in the most open country we could find, about 10 miles below our camp of the night before. Every precaution was taken to prevent a repetition of the run. Our best horses were chosen for night duty, as our regular ones were too exhausted, Every advantage of elevation for a bed ground was secured, and thus fortified against accidents, we went into camp for the night. But the expected never happens on the trail, and the sun arose the next morning over our herd grazing in peace and contentment on the flowery prairies which border on the Atascosa. Chapter 5